My name is Kayla Scott. I'm 29 years old. I'm a registered nurse. Let her go. We're not paying for another surgery. That's what my father said to the surgeon while I lay in a coma, tubes down my throat, machines breathing for me. My heart barely strong enough to keep a steady rhythm. He said it the way someone cancels a gym membership. No hesitation, no shaking voice, no pause. At 11:18 p.m. on a Tuesday night, my father signed a "Do Not Resuscitate" order for his own daughter. Not because the doctors told him I was beyond saving, but because the billing department told him the number. That was all it took. A number. 3 weeks later, I woke up in a hospital bed at Riverside Medical Center, bruised, stitched together, barely strong enough to lift my head off the pillow. My throat felt like sandpaper from the breathing tube they had finally removed. Every breath made my ribs ache. But the physical pain wasn't the worst part. Not even close. What I did next, what happened in the 72 hours after I learned the truth, didn't just change my life. It destroyed his. And the reason he never saw it coming is simple. My father forgot one thing about me. He forgot that I'm very good at paying attention. Before I continue, if you're listening to this story and something about it feels familiar, if you've ever been the one person in the family who's expected to carry the weight, quietly, consider liking the video and subscribing. Only if it truly resonates with you. Now let me take you back 7 months earlier, back to the day my grandmother died, because that's when everything actually began to fall apart. I was born with a hole in my heart. The cardiologist called it a ventricular septal defect. When I was 4 years old, surgeons opened my chest to repair it. My mother told me later the surgery took 11 hours. The hospital bill lasted a lot longer than that. 20 years, according to my mom. Or at least it took her 20 years to stop talking about it. My father never stopped. You know how much you cost this family, Kayla? I was 8 the first time he said it. I'd asked for a new pair of sneakers. The ones I had were splitting along the sole, and every time it rained, my socks came home soaked. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and hospital statements spread out in front of him. Yellow paper, red ink stamps, payment schedules. He didn't even look up when he answered. $214,000, he said flatly. That's what you cost. $214,000. At 8 years old, I didn't know exactly what that meant. But I understood enough. I didn't get the sneakers. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped asking for things altogether. By 15, I was babysitting 3 different families on our block just to pay for my own notebooks, pencils, and school supplies. Because in our house, every dollar spent on me had already been counted once before, and my father made sure I never forgot it. Some of the following events are fictional and aided by AI for educational and storytelling purposes. I hope you enjoyed this part. If not, get some rest, stay healthy, and see you again later. By the time I turned 18, I had already learned something important about my place in the Scott family. I was the expense. My older sister Lauren Scott was the investment. The difference between us showed up in 100 quiet ways no one ever talked about. Lauren got a car when she turned 16. A used Honda Civic, but still a car. My father handed her the keys in the driveway while our neighbors clapped. I took the bus. Lauren got her tuition paid when she left for Pennsylvania State University. My parents helped her pack boxes, bought her dorm furniture, and drove her there themselves. I sat alone at the kitchen table signing the paperwork for my first student loan. Nobody argued about it. Nobody even seemed to notice the difference. Lauren got birthday dinners at restaurants. I got a cake from a grocery store box mix and a birthday card signed only by my mother, Elaine Scott. And the strange part is that I accepted all of it. That's the part that's hardest for people to understand when they hear this story. I wasn't angry. Not then. I genuinely believed I owed them. My father had repeated the same sentence so many times over the years that it became a fact in my mind. You cost this family everything. After a while, the words stopped sounding cruel. They sounded like math. $214,000. That number lived in my head the way the scar lived on my chest, a thin, pale line just below my collarbone from the surgery that saved my life. I carried that debt the same way I carried my nurse's badge when I started working at the hospital. Quietly, automatically, without questioning it. There was only one person in my life who never mentioned that debt. My grandmother. Her name was Margaret Collins. Margaret Collins lived alone in a small brick house on Elm Street in Norristown, Pennsylvania. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow porch with a wooden swing that creaked every time the wind pushed against it. She had lived there for more than 40 years. She had raised my mother there. She had buried my grandfather from that house. And she had kept a small garden alive behind the house through every winter anyone could remember. I started visiting her every Saturday when I was 23. I had just finished nursing school. I was working long shifts at Riverside Medical Center and drowning in student loan payments. The drive from my apartment to her house took about 40 minutes each way. I would stop at the grocery store first, bring her fresh vegetables and milk, sometimes flowers if they were cheap that week. I would check her blood pressure, organize her medications, then sit with her on the porch swing. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. She liked telling stories about people I had never met. Neighbors who had moved away years ago. Teachers from the local elementary school. My mother when she was a little girl. But she also asked questions no one else asked me. Tell me about your week, sweetheart. Are they treating you well at that hospital? Did you remember to eat today? She never once said I owed her anything. Not once. Near the end of her life, though, she said something that stayed with me long after I left that porch. Her hands were shaking that day. Her voice had grown thin and soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. She squeezed my hand and said quietly, "Kayla, I've taken care of a few things for you." I smiled at her the way you smile at someone who's drifting between memories. "What things, Grandma?" "When the time comes," she said slowly, "a man named Andrew Keller will find you." I remember laughing softly. I thought she was confused. She had been forgetting little things around that time. Sometimes she repeated the same story twice in the same afternoon. She was 84 years old. I assumed the medication was making her foggy. I squeezed her hand and told her not to worry. My father hated that I visited her. "You're wasting gas," he told me once while standing in the kitchen doorway. "She doesn't even remember your name." That was a lie. My grandmother remembered everything until the day she died, including things my father would have preferred she forgot. She died on a Thursday morning in March. Quietly. In her sleep. In that same small brick house on Elm Street. My father handled the funeral arrangements. He made it quick. Small. Efficient. He didn't let me read a eulogy. "Keep it short," he told me outside the funeral home before the service started. "We're not making a spectacle out of this." So I stood in the back row and said goodbye in silence. My grandmother had said a man named Andrew Keller would find me someday. At the time, I had no idea who that was. Not yet. It would take a car accident, a signed death order, and 4 days in a hospital bed before that name meant anything at all. 3 months after my grandmother's funeral, I was driving home from a 12-hour overnight shift at the hospital. It was 4:17 in the morning. The road was nearly empty. And that was the moment everything changed. Route 202 was nearly empty that morning. A light rain was falling, the kind that turns the road into a dull gray mirror under the streetlights. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard. 4:17 a.m. I was doing the kind of math nurses do after overnight shifts. The tired kind. The practical kind. If I skipped breakfast, I could get 6 hours of sleep before my next shift. If I showered first, maybe 5. I never finished that calculation. The pickup truck ran the red light going at least 50 miles an hour. It hit the driver's side of my car so hard the metal folded inward like a soda can. I don't remember the sound. I don't remember the glass. The next part of the story was told to me later by the paramedics. Apparently, I was conscious for about 90 seconds after the impact. Long enough for one of them to kneel beside the crushed driver's door and ask my name. They said I whispered it. Kayla Scott. Then everything went black. The injuries were worse than anyone expected. Severe traumatic brain swelling, 4 broken ribs, internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. The ambulance rushed me to Riverside Medical Center, the same hospital where I had worked for the last 6 years. The same emergency department where I had clocked in and out 5 days a week. 5 days, Within an hour, the surgical team had opened my chest. But the bleeding didn't stop. They stabilized me long enough to realize they needed more time in the operating room, a second surgery, and a vascular specialist. And someone had to approve it. I didn't have a husband. I didn't have children. The emergency contact on my hospital file had been the same name since I was 18 years old. My father, Daniel Scott, next of kin. The hospital called him at 10:30 that night. He arrived at 10:47. I know the exact time because the front desk logged it in the visitor records. What he did when he arrived is something I didn't learn until weeks later. He didn't go to my room. He didn't ask a nurse how I was doing. He didn't ask if I was conscious. He didn't ask if I was in pain or if I had woken up even once. Instead, my father walked directly to the hospital's billing department, and he asked a single question. How much is this going to cost? I know this because of a woman named Patricia Walsh. Everyone at Riverside called her Pat. Pat had been the head nurse on the floor for 28 years. She had a voice like gravel, the kind that could silence a chaotic ER in 2 seconds flat. And she had a memory that missed nothing. Pat was standing at the nurse's station that night when my father walked out of the billing office and approached the surgeon managing my case. The surgeon's name was Dr. Michael Reeves. Pat heard the entire conversation. The second surgery, my father said. What's the estimate? Dr. Reeves answered honestly. Between 180 and 240,000 depending on complications. Insurance would cover part of it. But there would still be a large out-of-pocket cost. Especially because my father had insisted on co-signing some of my earlier medical accounts years before. At the time, I thought it was generosity. Later, I realized it was control. My father didn't blink when he heard the number. She doesn't have a healthcare proxy, he said calmly. I'm her father. I make the decisions. Dr. Reeves nodded carefully. That was the protocol. When no proxy is listed, the next of kin becomes the decision maker. And that's when my father said the words, "Let her go." Pat told me Dr. Reeves didn't respond right away. He stared at my father for several seconds. My father stared right back. She's been a financial drain her whole life, he added. Then he signed the form. Do not resuscitate. Pat said his hand was completely steady. No hesitation, no second thoughts. He placed the pen back on the counter, asked if there was anything else he needed to sign, and walked toward the elevator. He never came to see me. Not even once. He didn't look through the glass of the ICU room. He didn't say goodbye. He simply went home. And he went to sleep believing that by morning the hospital would call to tell him his daughter was dead. What my father didn't know that night was that someone else had been standing behind the nurse's station listening to every word. And that someone was about to make a phone call that would save my life. My father never visited my room that night. He never looked through the ICU window. He never said goodbye. After signing the Do Not Resuscitate order, Daniel Scott simply turned around and walked toward the elevator as if he had just finished paying a parking ticket. Patricia Walsh stood behind the nurse's station watching the entire thing. Later, when she told me the story, she said she was gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She said she wanted to scream. 28 years in a hospital had shown her a lot of ugly things. Families fighting over money, children abandoning elderly parents, spouses arguing over life support decisions. But watching a father calmly sign a paper to let his daughter die because of the cost of surgery was something else. Pat didn't scream. Instead, she did something much better. She sat down at the nurse's station computer and opened my employee file. Every nurse at Riverside Medical Center fills out an emergency information packet when they are hired. Contact details, insurance information, allergies, and a section most people skip because it feels uncomfortable. Healthcare proxy. The person legally authorized to make medical decisions if you cannot speak for yourself. Most people leave that section blank. I didn't. 3 years before that night, I had filled out that form very carefully. The name listed there was Emily Carter. Emily had been my best friend since nursing school. We survived anatomy exams together, shared cheap takeout dinners during night shifts, and spent long hours complaining about hospital bureaucracy. She lived about 45 minutes away in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Her name, phone number, and relationship were clearly listed in my file. Pat found it in less than 2 minutes. She picked up the phone and dialed. The time was 11:14 p.m. Emily answered on the second ring. Pat introduced herself and then told her everything. The accident, the coma, the surgery that needed authorization, and the father who had just signed an order to let his daughter die. Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply said 5 words. I'm leaving right now. The rain was still coming down when she got in her car. What should have been a 45-minute drive took nearly 90. She arrived at Riverside Medical Center at 12:51 a.m. Her hair was soaked. Her hands were shaking. She walked straight to the ICU desk holding 3 things: her driver's license, a printed copy of the healthcare proxy form she had kept in her filing cabinet at home, and the determination of someone who had already made up her mind. Emily Carter was legally my medical decision-maker, and the first decision she made that night was simple. She revoked the DNR order. The second decision came seconds later. She authorized the surgery. Dr. Michael Reeves was back in the operating room within the hour. While surgeons and nurses fought to keep me alive, my father was already at home, sleeping. He had no idea the DNR order had been overturned. As far as Daniel Scott knew, the machines in my hospital room would be turned off sometime before morning, and the hospital would call him with the news. Pat didn't call him. Emily didn't call him. No one did. Instead, Pat did one more thing before her shift ended. She opened the hospital's internal reporting system and filed an incident report, the kind that gets written when a staff member witnesses something that might violate medical protocol. She documented everything. The exact words my father had spoken, the timestamps from the billing office, the DNR form he signed, and the fact that he had falsely claimed I had no healthcare proxy. After submitting the report, Pat shut down the computer and walked into the staff break room. She sat there alone for 20 minutes before going back to work. That night, my father went to bed believing his daughter would be dead by morning. He slept well. The next day, he made his second mistake, the one that would eventually cost him everything he owned. My father woke up Wednesday morning expecting the hospital to call him. A time of death. Maybe a form to sign. I can imagine exactly what he rehearsed saying. The soft sigh, the hand over his chest. We lost her. The injuries were just too severe. But the phone never rang. Not because anyone told him I was alive. It simply never rang. And instead of calling the hospital himself, instead of driving over to check on his youngest daughter, Daniel Scott spent that Wednesday morning doing something else entirely. Something that would later become the most expensive decision of his life. That Wednesday morning, instead of calling the hospital to check whether his daughter was still alive, my father did something else. He went to steal my house. I didn't know any of this at the time. I wouldn't learn the details until weeks later after I was awake and strong enough to ask questions. After documents started surfacing. After lawyers began pulling records from county offices. But this is what happened while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. My grandmother, Margaret Collins, had already transferred the house on Elm Street into my name before she died. She did it quietly. She didn't tell my father. She didn't tell my mother. She arranged everything through her own attorney, a man named Andrew Keller. The paperwork was clean, legal, filed with the county recorder's office months before her funeral. The deed listed exactly one owner, Kayla Scott. My father had no idea. What he did know was that Margaret Collins was gone. The house was empty. And in his mind, empty meant available. So he decided to make sure the person claiming it would be him. My father already had a document prepared, a power of attorney form. My name was on it. So was my signature. Except I had never signed it. Later, we discovered how he had done it. Years earlier, when I had turned 18, my father had insisted I sign a stack of medical consent forms connected to my old heart condition records. He kept copies. Apparently, he also kept samples of my handwriting. When he created the fake power of attorney document, he traced my signature from those old forms. The result was convincing enough for someone who didn't look too closely. And my father knew exactly the kind of person who wouldn't look closely. The notary he used was a man named Carl Henderson. Carl owned a small insurance office 2 blocks from my father's plumbing business. They had known each other for years. Carl owed my father a favor, and more importantly, Carl didn't ask questions. My father walked into Carl's office that Wednesday afternoon with the forged document. Carl stamped it. Just like that. With a single press of a notary seal, the lie became official paperwork. That same afternoon, my father drove to the Montgomery County Recorder's office and filed the transfer documents. By Thursday, the house on Elm Street had been transferred out of my name and into his. By Friday morning, my father walked into a bank and used that house as collateral for a mortgage. Within a week, he had $280,000 in cash. You might think that money went toward my hospital bills. It didn't. It didn't go into savings. It didn't go toward helping the daughter he believed was dying in an ICU room. The money disappeared somewhere else entirely. It went to pay off gambling debts. Debts my father had been hiding for years. Debts no one in our family knew about. Not my mother, not my sister Lauren, not the people at church who praised him every Sunday. Not the neighbors who trusted him to fix their pipes and their heating systems. No one knew. Except the men who had been waiting for their money. My father thought he had solved 2 problems at once. His daughter's hospital bills would never arrive because she would be dead, and the house would quietly become his. But there were 2 things he didn't know. First, he didn't know the house had already been legally transferred to me before he filed those documents, which meant the county records now contained 2 conflicting deeds. Second, he had no idea that Margaret Collins had hired a lawyer who paid attention to details. And forged signatures only work for as long as nobody looks closely. Sooner or later, someone always looks. 3 weeks after the accident, that someone turned out to be me. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday morning. The first thing I saw was light. Bright blue-white light, the kind that only exists in hospitals. Too clean. Too flat. No warmth at all. I knew that light immediately. I had worked under it for years, but I had never been on this side of it before. My throat felt raw. My ribs ached every time I tried to breathe, and somewhere nearby a heart monitor beeped steadily, reminding me that somehow, despite everything, I was still alive. I had worked under that hospital light for 6 years, but I had never been on this side of it before. My throat felt raw, like I had swallowed sand. The breathing tube had already been removed, but I could still feel where it had been deep in my chest, like a bruise that hadn't healed yet. Every breath made my ribs ache. My left arm was wrapped in a soft cast. Everything felt heavy. Even blinking took effort. The first face I saw when I opened my eyes was Patricia Walsh. Not my father. Not my sister Lauren. Pat. She was standing near the window with her arms crossed, watching the monitors above my bed. When she noticed my eyes open, she didn't gasp or rush forward the way families do in movies. Pat was too experienced for that. She pulled a chair beside my bed and sat down calmly. Then she took my hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "You're safe," she said quietly. Then she added, "There are some things I need to tell you. Not now. When you're ready." I tried to speak. My voice came out cracked and thin. "How long?" "3 weeks," she said. "The surgery went well. You're going to be fine." I closed my eyes again. Not because I was tired, because I was trying to remember how I ended up there. The rain, the red light, the truck, the impact. Then nothing. The hospital room door opened sometime that afternoon. Later, I learned the exact time. 2:17 p.m. The nurses logged it. My father stepped inside. Daniel Scott stood in the doorway for a second before walking toward my bed. I watched his face carefully. Working in an ICU teaches you how to read people. I had watched thousands of families stand beside hospital beds over the years. Fear of losing someone looks one way. Fear of being caught looks different. For half a second, something flashed across my father's face. Then it disappeared. His expression rearranged itself into something softer, something practiced. He rushed forward and grabbed my hand. Tears were already sliding down his cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice shaking. "We were so scared. Thank God. Thank God you're okay." I looked at him quietly, at the tears, at the trembling lip. "Hi, Dad," I said. That evening, my sister Lauren Scott sent flowers, a generic bouquet ordered online. She didn't come to the hospital. 2 days later, I was strong enough to sit up by myself. That afternoon, Pat came back to my room. She waited until the hallway outside had quieted during the shift change so the door could stay closed without anyone asking questions. She pulled the same chair beside my bed. But this time, she didn't sit right away. She stood there for a moment, looking at me like someone trying to decide where to begin. "Just say it, Pat," I told her. She sat down slowly. "The night of your accident, your father came to the hospital." "I know," I said. "He told me he's been here every day." Pat shook her head. "He came once. Just once." I kept my hands still on the blanket. "That night he spoke to Dr. Michael Reeves," she continued. "He asked about the cost of your surgery." I didn't interrupt. Pat continued quietly. "He told Dr. Reeves you had no healthcare proxy. He said he was the only decision maker. And then he signed a do not resuscitate order." The room fell silent. The heart monitor beside me beeped steadily. I counted the sounds. 1, 2, 3. "He signed a DNR," I said. "Yes." "On me?" "Yes." I turned my head slowly toward her. "What exactly did he say?" Pat held my gaze. "His exact words were recorded in the incident report." She spoke slowly. "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life." I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked. Because hearing those words out loud finally gave shape to something I had always felt, but never named. My entire life had been a number, a bill, a cost that never stopped growing. I opened my eyes again. "How am I alive?" Pat answered immediately. "I found your healthcare proxy in your employee file. Emily Carter." I called her. I nodded slowly. "Emily. She drove here in the middle of the night and authorized the surgery," Pat said. "Everything your father said is documented. Timestamps, incident report, all of it." I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I turned back to Pat. "Get me my phone." She reached into the drawer of my bedside table and handed it to me. When the screen turned on, I saw 32 missed calls from my father, 11 from Lauren. I scrolled past every one of them. Instead, I opened my contact list and searched for a name I hadn't called in months. A name my grandmother had mentioned on that porch swing. Andrew Keller. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Andrew Keller speaking. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime reading legal documents and rarely found anything surprising anymore. I tightened my grip on the phone. "Mr. Keller," I said softly. "My name is Kayla Scott. My grandmother, Margaret Collins, told me that someday you might be expecting my call." "Mr. Keller, my name is Kayla Scott. I think my grandmother, Margaret Collins." He interrupted me gently. "I know who you are, Miss Scott. I've been trying to reach you for 4 months." I tightened my grip on the phone. My ribs protested when I shifted in the hospital bed, but I ignored the pain. "What do you mean you've been trying to reach me?" Andrew Keller spoke in the calm, measured tone of someone used to delivering complicated information. "Your grandmother came to my office 2 years before she died. She was very clear about what she wanted." He paused briefly as if reviewing the memory. "She told me she wanted to prepare a will privately, not through the family attorney, not through anyone her son might know." He continued. "She asked that everything be handled confidentially, notarized by my own staff, and sealed until the proper time." I could picture my grandmother sitting across from his desk. Her eyes sharp, her voice steady. The way she always sounded when she had already made up her mind. "The will itself was simple," Keller said. "The property on Elm Street in Norristown was left solely to you, Kayla Scott." He paused again. "There was also a trust account. $85,000. Also left solely to you." I blinked slowly. "No other names? No conditions," he added. "The estate was probated 5 months ago. The court confirmed the will and the deed transfer was filed with the county." My fingers tightened around the phone. "You're saying the house is legally mine?" It was Keller said. "I sent multiple certified letters to your address informing you. Every one of them was returned." My stomach tightened. "I also called the phone number listed on the estate documents," he continued. "A man answered and told me you had moved out of state and did not wish to be contacted." My father. I knew it instantly. That voice had been my father's. Daniel Scott had told the lawyer handling my grandmother's estate that I was gone, that I didn't want to be found. "Mr. Keller," I said slowly, "I'm in the hospital. I was in a car accident. I've been in a coma for 3 weeks." There was a pause on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that, Miss Scott," he replied. "The house," I said. "Is it still in my name?" This time the silence lasted longer. "Let me check the current deed records," Keller said carefully. "I will call you back within the hour." The call ended. I set the phone down on my chest and stared at the ceiling. Patricia Walsh was still standing near the door of my hospital room. Before hanging up, Keller had said one more thing. "Your grandmother told me you would eventually call," he had said. "She told me Kayla always comes through. Just give her time." It took less than an hour for everything to change. 53 minutes later, my phone rang. Andrew Keller's voice sounded different this time, still controlled. But there was tension underneath it now. "Miss Scott," he said, "the deed to your grandmother's property was transferred out of your name 3 weeks ago." I stared at the IV line in my arm and watched the slow drip of clear fluid. 1, 2, 3. "Transferred to who?" I asked. "Daniel Scott," Keller replied. "Your father." My chest tightened. "How there is a power of attorney document attached to the transfer," he said. I felt a strange calm settle over me. "I never signed a power of attorney." "I know," Keller said. "I have the original probate documents here in front of me. The deed transferring the property to you was notarized by my office. No power of attorney from you has ever been authorized through my firm." "So it's forged," I said. "That would be my professional assessment." There was a pause. "And there's something else," Keller added. "I ran a lien search on the property." My hand tightened around the phone. "A mortgage was recorded against the house 6 days ago. How much?" $280,000. The number seemed to hang in the hospital room like another person. Pat watched me from across the room but didn't interrupt. I could hear Keller breathing quietly on the other end of the line. He leveraged the house, I said finally. Yes, Keller confirmed. I reached for the pen on the bedside table. My hand wasn't shaking. I'm not sure why. Maybe because nothing about this surprised me anymore. Maybe because I had spent 29 years learning exactly who my father was. And this was simply the final lesson. I wrote everything down as Keller spoke. The mortgage amount, the recording date, the lender's name, the notary stamp number, every detail. Miss Scott, Keller said after a moment. Do you want to press charges? Not yet, I replied. I want to see how deep this goes first. There was a short pause. There is one more thing, he said. Your grandmother left you a sealed letter. She asked that it be delivered to you personally. I set the pen down. When can you come to the hospital tomorrow morning? Keller said. 9 o'clock. I'll be here. The call ended. I wrote the last number on the page and then looked up at Pat. She had been standing quietly by the window the entire time. Pat, I said, what time did my father sign the DNR? She didn't hesitate. 11:18 p.m. I wrote that down too. The next afternoon, my father walked into my hospital room carrying a bouquet of yellow roses and a plastic container of banana bread. Lauren baked it for you, he said with a smile. If you think the secret my grandmother left behind is the kind that could change my life forever, then type 1 in the comments right now. I'm curious to know how many of you are still following this story closely. My father placed the flowers and the banana bread on the small table beside my bed. Then he leaned down, kissed my forehead, and sat in the chair beside me with the long, heavy sigh of a man carrying the weight of the world. He was good at this. The performance. I had watched it my entire life, at parent-teacher conferences, at church potlucks, at holiday dinners where neighbors praised him for being such a devoted father. Daniel Scott knew exactly how to play the role of the tired provider. The quiet man who sacrificed everything and never complained. The doctors say you'll be out in about a week, he said, squeezing my hand gently. Don't worry about anything. We'll take care of it. Thank you, Dad, I said softly. A moment later, the door opened again. My sister Lauren Scott stepped into the room. It was her first visit since the accident. She stood at the foot of my bed holding her phone in one hand. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. We were so worried, she said quickly. I couldn't sleep for weeks. I looked at her. She looked past me toward the window. My father leaned closer to me, lowering his voice in that warm tone he used whenever he wanted someone to feel safe. Don't worry about the medical bills, sweetheart, he said. We'll figure everything out as a family. That's what families do. As a family. The man who had signed a paper that would have let me die was now sitting beside my bed holding my hand and talking about family. As a family, I repeated quietly. I squeezed his hand. I smiled. He smiled back satisfied. He believed the script was working. They stayed for 40 minutes. My father talked about the weather, about a Phillies game he watched on television, about a plumbing job he had finished the previous Saturday. Lauren checked her phone 11 times. Then they left. I watched the door close behind them. For 10 seconds I didn't move. The room was silent. Then I picked up my phone. I called Andrew Keller. Mr. Keller, I said when he answered. When can you come to the hospital? And please, bring the letter. Andrew Keller arrived the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. He was shorter than I had imagined. A quiet man wearing a gray suit, silver-framed glasses, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been used for decades. He shook my hand carefully, mindful of the IV line, then pulled a chair next to my bed. Your grandmother spoke about you often, he said. Every meeting we had, she mentioned you. He opened his briefcase. Inside was a sealed manila envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Thin. Careful. Margaret Collins. My grandmother. My name was written across the front. Just 2 words. Kayla. I broke the seal slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. Her handwriting was steady. She had written it while she could still hold a pen without her hand shaking. I began reading. Kayla. I know your father will try to take everything. He has already taken many things over the years. My pension. My savings. Things I never told you because I didn't want to break the family apart. That was my mistake. Don't make the same one. The house is yours. The money is yours. Mr. Keller has all the paperwork. Do not let anyone take what belongs to you. Not even your father. Especially your father. You are stronger than I ever was, sweetheart. You always have been. I'm sorry I didn't say this while I could still hold your hand. I finished reading the letter and the words blurred in front of me. It was the first time I had cried since waking up from the coma. Not because I was weak, but because my grandmother had seen me. Really seen me. And she had prepared for this moment quietly, the same way she had always done everything in her life, without asking for recognition, without applause. Andrew Keller waited patiently. When I finally wiped my face, he placed a thick folder on the blanket beside me. Inside were copies of every document connected to my grandmother's estate. The will, the probate confirmation, the original deed transferring the Elm Street house into my name, and the property lien report showing the mortgage my father had taken out against it. You have everything you need, Keller said calmly. What do you want to do? I pushed myself upright. My ribs screamed in protest. I ignored the pain. I want to do this the right way, I said, and I want it done publicly. Keller raised an eyebrow slightly. Before Sunday? What Sunday? He asked. Our church holds a community gathering once a month, I said. My father is a deacon there. He never misses it. 5 days after I woke up, the hospital discharged me. I was still sore, still bruised, still moving slower than normal. But I could walk. I could think. And I could make decisions. That was all that mattered. At 10 o'clock that morning, my father arrived to pick me up. He brought a suitcase with him. You're staying with us until you recover, he said firmly. He didn't ask. He simply announced it. My father announced it the way he announced everything in our house. Not as a suggestion, as a decision. You're staying with us until you recover. Daniel Scott said, setting the suitcase he brought beside the hospital bed. That's kind of you, Dad, I replied calmly. But Emily is picking me up. She has a spare room. His expression changed. Not dramatically. My father had spent a lifetime practicing control. His mask never slipped far, but the corners of his mouth tightened slightly. You'd rather stay with a stranger than with your own family. She's not a stranger, I said. She's been my emergency contact for 3 years. Something flickered behind his eyes. A calculation. For a moment I thought he might connect the pieces. That he might realize Emily was the reason I was still alive. But the thought passed. He didn't see it. Not yet. Fine, he said shortly. He picked up the suitcase he had brought and walked out of the hospital room without another word. He didn't even say goodbye. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. Lauren, Dad's upset. A moment later, another message appeared. Lauren, you're being ungrateful after everything he's been through. I read the messages. Then I placed the phone face down on the table. I didn't reply. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table in Emily Carter's apartment. Emily poured tea while I called Andrew Keller. We went over everything. The timeline, the forged power of attorney, the illegal deed transfer, the mortgage filed against the Elm Street house. Keller confirmed the legal steps. A motion had already been prepared to void the fraudulent deed. A police report for forgery was ready to file. The mortgage lender would be notified that the property title was under dispute. Everything was organized. Everything was ready. Sunday, I said. Sunday, Keller agreed. That night my father called. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I wanted to hear his voice. By the way, he said casually after a few seconds of small talk, "Your grandmother's house. I've been taking care of the estate paperwork." His tone sounded relaxed, almost rehearsed. "Don't worry about it," he added. "I'll explain everything once you're feeling better." He was testing me, checking the perimeter, trying to see if I knew. "Okay, Dad," I said. "Thanks for taking care of it." I hung up. Emily was standing in the doorway watching me. "How do you do that?" she asked. "How do you stay so calm?" I shrugged slightly. "Practice," I said. 29 years of practice. Then I told her about my father's church. First Grace Community Church sits on a quiet tree-lined road in a suburb west of Philadelphia. Red brick walls, a tall white steeple, and a parking lot that fills every Sunday before 10 o'clock. About 120 people attend regularly: families, retirees, teachers, small business owners, the kind of congregation where everyone knows your name, your children's names, and exactly what casserole you brought to the last potluck. My father had been a deacon there for 15 years. He greeted people at the door every Sunday morning. He read scripture from the lectern. He organized the men's breakfast group. After every service, he stood near the exit shaking hands and asking people about their families. When the church needed money for a new roof, my father led the fundraising. When someone's furnace broke in the middle of winter, he fixed it himself and refused payment. Pastor David Reynolds mentioned him often during sermons, a man of faith and sacrifice. That phrase had been repeated so many times over the years it almost echoed in my head. On the first Sunday of every month, the church held a community gathering in the fellowship hall. Long folding tables, casserole dishes, paper plates, and a microphone near the front where people shared prayers and blessings. My father always spoke, and he always talked about gratitude, about family, about giving without expecting anything in return. 120 people believed every word he said. This coming Sunday was the first Sunday of the month. Saturday evening, I called Andrew Keller. "Can you be there tomorrow at noon?" I asked. "I'll be there at 11:30, he replied. I ended the call and leaned back on Emily's couch. My ribs still hurt when I breathed too deeply. The bruises on my arms had faded from dark purple to yellow. I could walk again without wincing. Slowly, carefully, but upright. I wasn't planning a scene. I was planning a conversation. But when 120 people are watching, every conversation becomes a stage. Sunday morning, I woke up before my alarm. 7 a.m. I stood in front of Emily's bathroom mirror and studied my reflection. The bruise along my jaw had almost faded. The one beneath my eye had turned pale green. My collarbone still ached when I lifted my arm. I looked like someone who had been hit by a truck. Because I had been. I put on a white button-down shirt and black slacks. Nothing fancy. No jewelry except the small silver earrings my grandmother had given me for my 21st birthday. I tied my hair back, washed my face, skipped makeup. Then I picked up the manila folder waiting on the kitchen table. Inside were copies of everything: my grandmother's will, the original deed placing the Elm Street house in my name, the county records showing the mortgage my father had taken out, and the hospital incident report Pat had given me, the one with my father's exact words printed clearly on official letterhead. "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery." I slid the folder into my bag. Emily drove. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. At 11:20 a.m., she turned onto the road leading to the church and parked near the back of the lot. The white steeple caught the sunlight above the trees. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "I've never been more sure," I said. She squeezed my hand. "Whatever happens in there, I'll be right outside." I nodded. Then I opened the car door. Andrew Keller was already there. He stood near the flagpole by the church entrance. Gray suit, leather briefcase, the patient posture of a man who bills by the hour and is never in a hurry. He saw me and gave a small nod. I walked through the church doors. The service had already started. Soft hymns filled the room. The smell of old carpet and coffee hung in the air. I slipped quietly into the last pew and sat down. My father was seated in the front row. He turned when he heard the door open. His face lit up immediately. The proud father. The grateful deacon. The man of faith and sacrifice. He raised his hand and waved. I waved back. A small wave. A patient wave. Lauren was sitting beside my father in the front row. She glanced back when I walked into the church. Our eyes met for half a second. She didn't wave. The service ended exactly at noon. People stood stretched and slowly began filing into the fellowship hall. It was a wide room with a low ceiling and bright fluorescent lights. Folding tables had been arranged in rows across the floor. Aluminum trays filled with baked ziti and green bean casserole lined the tables. Paper plates were stacked beside tall towers of napkins. Near the front of the room stood the microphone that was always used during the monthly gathering. My father was already there. He always was. Daniel Scott stood beside the microphone with his hands clasped in front of him, waiting for the room to quiet down. 120 people found their seats. Chairs scraped softly against the linoleum floor while children ran between tables. My father tapped the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," the small speaker hummed. "I want to begin with something personal today." The room grew quiet. "As many of you know," he continued, "my youngest daughter Kayla was in a serious car accident last month. She was in a coma for 3 weeks. The doctors weren't sure she was going to make it." He paused. My father had always been good at pauses. But God is faithful. And today, Kayla is here with us. He turned and gestured toward the back of the room. I was standing near the wall. Every head turned. People began applauding. Warm applause. Real applause. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her heart. An elderly man nodded solemnly. As a father, my father continued, his voice cracking at exactly the right moment, "There is nothing more terrifying than almost losing your child." I prayed every single night. I never left her side. The words landed in my chest. Not like a wound. Like a key turning slowly in a lock. I never left her side. He had just said that to 120 people who had no reason to doubt him. "Family is everything," he continued. "That's what I've always tried to teach my daughters." He looked at me. He smiled. Then he opened his arms slightly, the universal gesture of a father welcoming his child. I smiled back. Then I started walking toward him. The room watched with soft, hopeful expressions. "Dad," I said once I reached the front of the room loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Can I say a few words?" He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. Not after introducing me as a miracle in front of the entire congregation. "Of course, sweetheart," he said. He handed me the microphone with a confident smile. Then he stepped aside, folding his hands behind his back, playing the supportive father perfectly. The microphone felt warm in my hand. I didn't look at him. I looked at the room. "Thank you all for your prayers," I began. "I'm grateful to be standing here today." Then I paused. "But I do need to correct something my father just said." The room went completely still. My father's smile faded slightly. "My father didn't pray beside my hospital bed," I continued. "He came to the hospital once, the night of the accident, and he didn't go to see me. He went to the billing department first." A few people shifted in their chairs. After that, he spoke to my surgeon and asked how much the surgery would cost. I could feel my father move beside me. I didn't turn. And when the doctor told him the number, I continued. He said something that was written down in an official hospital incident report. I took a breath. His exact words were, "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. She's been a financial drain her whole life." Silence fell across the room, not the comfortable kind. The kind that presses against your ears. Someone in the middle row inhaled sharply. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Then he signed a "Do Not Resuscitate" order. I held the microphone steady. I'm alive today because a nurse at the hospital found my healthcare proxy and called my friend in the middle of the night. My friend drove 90 minutes through the rain to authorize the surgery. Not my father. Not my sister. A friend. My father stepped forward. "Kayla, stop," he said sharply. "You don't understand what you're saying." "I'm not finished, Dad," I replied calmly. "This isn't the place for this," he said. "You chose this church to tell a lie," I answered. "I'm choosing the same church to tell the truth." "You're confused," he said quickly. "You're still on medication. I have the hospital records right here." The room didn't move. No one reached for their food. No one checked their phone. 120 people were holding their breath. My father stopped speaking. At that exact moment, the side door of the fellowship hall opened. Andrew Keller walked inside. Gray suit, leather briefcase, calm, steady steps. He didn't search for a seat. He walked straight to the front of the room and stood beside me. For the first time in my entire life, I watched my father look genuinely afraid. Not angry. Not offended. Afraid. "This is Andrew Keller," I said into the microphone. He was my grandmother Margaret Collins's attorney. A quiet murmur moved through the room. My grandmother had attended this church for 30 years. Her name still meant something here. My grandmother left me her house and her savings in a will that was notarized and confirmed by the court 5 months ago. I paused so the words could settle. My father didn't know about it because my grandmother didn't trust him. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. "While I was in a coma," I continued, "my father forged my signature on a power of attorney document. He transferred the house into his own name, and he took out a $280,000 mortgage against it." A loud gasp came from the back of the room. A dish slipped from someone's hands and hit the floor. A fork clattered across the linoleum. "That's a lie," my father shouted suddenly. "My mother left that house to the whole family." Andrew Keller calmly opened his briefcase. He removed a document and held it so the people in the front rows could see the seal. "I have the original will here," Mr. Scott Keller said quietly. "Margaret Collins left the property solely to Kayla Scott. Your name does not appear anywhere in this document." My father turned toward Lauren. She was staring down at the floor. I lowered the microphone and spoke directly to him. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Dad. I'm here because you tried to let me die. And when that didn't work, you robbed me." My father turned toward the crowd. His jaw tightened. "She's on heavy medication," he said quickly. "She doesn't know what she's saying. This is a private family matter." No one answered my father. The room had gone completely still. 120 people sat there with their arms folded or resting quietly on the tables, their eyes fixed on the man who had stood in front of them every Sunday for 15 years, talking about faith, sacrifice, and family. Then a voice came from the back row. It was a man I didn't recognize. "If this is a private family matter," he said calmly, "then why is there a lawyer here?" "Daniel?" My father didn't respond. His eyes shifted across the room until they landed on Pastor David Reynolds, who was standing near the coffee table with his hands in his pockets. The pastor spoke quietly. "Daniel, I think we should hear this out." My father shifted his weight. I watched him change strategies the way he always did when authority slipped away from him. His shoulders dropped. His voice softened. "I've sacrificed everything for this family," he said. "Kayla's medical bills nearly bankrupted us when she was a child. I did what I thought was best." I didn't lift the microphone. I simply spoke from where I stood. "You did what was cheapest, Dad. There's a difference." His jaw tightened. "You have no idea the pressure I've been under," he snapped. The debts, he stopped mid-sentence. His mouth closed abruptly. He realized what he had almost admitted. My sister Lauren Scott suddenly stood up from her chair. Her face had gone pale. "Dad, she said quietly. Stop talking. My father grabbed her arm. Tell them, Lauren, he demanded. Tell them I was trying to protect the family. Lauren pulled her arm free. She looked at me, then at the floor, then at the door. I can't do this, she said. She began walking toward the exit. As she passed me, she leaned close enough that only I could hear her. I should have called Emily myself. 6 words. I will carry them with me for the rest of my life. Then she walked out. The door closed behind her. The entire room was still watching me. I turned back to the congregation. I'm not telling you this to destroy my father, I said. I'm telling you because for 15 years he has stood at this microphone and told you who he is. I think you deserve to know the truth. Then I looked directly at him. He was standing near the wall now. The confident deacon who had started this gathering was gone. In his place stood a man who looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Dad, I said calmly, here's what's going to happen. My voice was steady now. I didn't need the microphone. The room was quiet enough to hear someone turning a page at the back table. Andrew Keller filed a motion with the county court yesterday to void the deed transfer because it was based on a forged power of attorney. My father's jaw clenched. The bank that issued the mortgage has been notified that the property title is under dispute. His left hand began to tremble. The loan has been frozen. I also filed a police report on Friday, I continued. Forgery and fraud. The notary who stamped your document has been named in the report. My father took a small step backward. You will be required to return the full $280,000, I said. Or you will face criminal charges. His voice came out hoarse. You'd send your own father to jail. I looked directly at him. You signed a paper to let your own daughter die. The fellowship hall held its breath. A child somewhere near the back whispered a question and was quickly shushed by his mother. I'm not sending you anywhere, Dad, I said quietly. I'm giving you a chance to make it right. That's more than you gave me. Beside me, Andrew Keller closed his briefcase with a soft click. The filings are all ready with the court, Mr. Scott, he said calmly. This is not a negotiation. My father slowly turned his head and looked around the room. I watched him do it. One face at a time. These were people he had known for years. Jim Callahan, whose plumbing he fixed every winter. Susan Merritt, who brought him coffee after every Sunday service. Robert Dill, the other deacon who had worked beside him for more than a decade. They all looked back at him. None of them looked away. None of them stepped forward to defend him. My father sat down heavily on the edge of the nearest folding table. Not in a chair. Just on the table. He buried his face in his hands. Robert Dill walked over and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Not a comforting gesture. A final one. Daniel, Robert said quietly, I think you should leave. My father stood. He walked slowly toward the door. His shoes made no sound against the linoleum floor. At the doorway he turned and looked back at me. His eyes were red. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something. One final sentence. One last speech that would restore the room. But nothing came out. He left. I set the microphone down on the nearest table. My hands were steady. My ribs still hurt. I didn't care. I'm sorry for interrupting your Sunday, I said to the room. My grandmother, Margaret Collins, loved this church. She would have wanted the truth spoken here. 2 women walked forward and hugged me. A man I had never met shook my hand silently. Across the room I saw Patricia Walsh, who had quietly arrived before the service and had been standing near the coffee station the entire time. She caught my eye and gave a single firm nod. Then someone touched my arm. I turned. An elderly woman with white hair and a cardigan stood beside me. Her glasses hung from a thin chain around her neck. I'm Doris Brennan, she said gently. Your grandmother and I sat together every Sunday for 20 years. I nodded. My throat felt tight. She talked about you every week, Doris said. She was so proud of you, Kayla. She never stopped talking about you. I had spent my entire life believing I was invisible in my father's world. Margaret Collins had made sure that wasn't true. Within 24 hours, everything my father had built began to collapse. Monday morning, the bank froze the mortgage. By noon, a fraud attorney from the lender's office had contacted Andrew Keller. The property title had been officially flagged as disputed. The loan was suspended. My father could not access the money. He could not refinance. He could not sell the house. The $280,000 he had already spent was gone, and the debt now belonged entirely to him. That same afternoon, the county court accepted Keller's motion to void the deed transfer. At 3:15 p.m., a process server knocked on my father's front door and handed him a court summons. A neighbor across the street watched the whole thing while collecting the mail. The police opened a formal investigation into forgery and fraud. The notary Carl Henderson was named in the report. By Tuesday, Carl had already hired his own lawyer, and Carl was cooperating with investigators. My father was on his own. News traveled through the church faster than any sermon ever had. Tuesday evening, the church board voted unanimously to remove Daniel Scott from his position as deacon. Robert Dill called him personally. My father didn't argue. He didn't attend the meeting. His plumbing business began losing clients almost immediately. 3 cancellations Monday. 5 more by Wednesday. Most of them were church members. One of them was Jim Callahan. Jim sent him a text message with a single sentence: "Don't come to my house again." My father called me at 10 that night. I answered. "You destroyed me," he said. His voice sounded empty. "No, Dad," I replied calmly. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped covering for you." He hung up. Later that week, Andrew Keller found something else. 3 years earlier, my father had changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. The name had been changed from Emily Carter to Daniel Scott. My signature was on the form, but I had never signed it. My father had a plan for every version of my death. None of those plans involved saving me. 3 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Lauren. I was sitting on Emily's couch with a heating pad across my ribs and a cup of tea going cold on the table. I stared at the phone for 2 full rings before answering. "Kayla," Lauren said. Her voice was thick with tears. Lauren had been crying when I answered the phone. I could hear it immediately in her breathing. "I need to say something," she said. "Then say it," I replied. There was a pause on the line. Then the words came out all at once. "I knew about the DNR. I didn't say anything." I was in the waiting room when Dad went to talk to the doctor, she continued. "He told me what he was going to do. And I didn't stop him. I didn't say anything." Her voice shook. I just sat there. I let the silence do what silence does. Another pause. "And the house," she said quietly. "I knew about that too. He told me he was transferring it into his name. He promised me $85,000 if I kept quiet." I closed my eyes. "And you kept quiet," I said. "Yes. While I was in a coma. Yes." Her voice cracked. "I was scared of him, Kayla," she whispered. "I've always been scared of him." "I know that's not an excuse." "It's not," I said. On the other end of the line, she began crying harder. Not the quiet kind of crying adults usually do. The messy kind. The uncontrolled kind. The way she used to cry when we were children. For years, that sound had always made me want to fix things for her. This time, I didn't move. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Lauren said between breaths. "I know I don't deserve it." "You're right," I said. "You don't. Not right now." There was a long silence. I could hear her breathing, thin and uneven. "But I'm not going to pretend you don't exist either," I said finally. "If you ever want to rebuild something with me, not with Dad's money, you know where to find me." She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Grandma Margaret wrote me a letter too." I sat up straighter on the couch. "What did it say?" Lauren sniffed. She wrote, I love you, Lauren, but you are too much like your father. Choose differently. The line went quiet. Did you, I asked softly, choose differently? She didn't answer. Because we both already knew the truth. Forgiveness is not something anyone is owed. But the door isn't locked. It's simply closed. If she ever wants to walk through it, she'll have to knock. 1 month later, the deed to the Elm Street house was officially restored to my name. The court voided the fraudulent transfer on a Wednesday morning. Andrew Keller called me at 10 o'clock to tell me the ruling. I thanked him. He laughed softly. "Thank your grandmother," he said. Then he paused before adding, "She would have loved seeing what you did in that fellowship hall." My father faced criminal charges. Forgery in the 3rd degree. Fraud. Mortgage fraud. His attorney advised him to take a plea deal. Probation. Full financial restitution. No prison time if he cooperated. My father accepted. He didn't have much choice. The evidence was overwhelming. And Carl Henderson, the notary who stamped the forged document, had already told investigators everything. To repay part of the debt, my father sold his house. It still wasn't enough. The remaining balance would follow him for years. Eventually, he moved in with his brother in Allentown. I heard that through Lauren, who heard it from one of our cousins. I never checked. I didn't need to. Lauren also lost 2 real estate listings from church members. She kept her license. She was never charged with anything. She hadn't signed any documents. But people remembered. People always remember. I returned to work at Riverside Medical Center slowly, part-time at first. Patricia Walsh rearranged the schedule so I would only work day shifts for the first 2 months. She didn't make a big announcement about it. She just handed me the new rotation sheet and said, "Welcome back, Scott." On a quiet Saturday in late October, I drove to Norristown. I parked on Elm Street. Then I walked up the path to the small brick house with the creaking porch swing. The garden had grown wild, leaves covered the steps. I unlocked the front door. My key. My door. The first thing I smelled when I stepped inside was lavender. My grandmother used to tuck lavender sachets into every drawer and closet. The scent still filled the house. Her photograph sat on the mantel above the fireplace, the 2 of us sitting on the porch swing, squinting into the sun. I don't remember who took the photo. I sat down in her old rocking chair. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check my phone. I just sat there. For the first time in my life, I was sitting in a house that was mine. Not because someone approved of me, not because someone gave me permission, but because someone loved me enough to make sure I would be okay. For most of my life, I believed being a good daughter meant absorbing whatever your family threw at you. Every insult, every guilt trip, every time my father reminded me how much I had cost him, I accepted it all and said thank you. Because I believed that was what love required. Silence, gratitude, obedience. I was wrong. Setting a boundary isn't revenge. It's survival. And sometimes survival looks like a quiet lawyer in a gray suit, a stack of notarized documents, and the courage to stand in front of 120 people and say the words that have been waiting to be said for years. This is what actually happened. I don't hate my father. Hating him would mean he still controls how I feel. He doesn't. He's simply a man who made terrible choices. Choices driven by debts he was too proud to admit, and addictions he was too ashamed to face. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it does explain why I don't have to carry his weight anymore. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself anywhere in it, in the guilt, the silence, the belief that you owe people who hurt you, then hear this clearly. You don't. You don't owe anyone your health. You don't owe anyone your home. And you certainly don't owe anyone your life. My grandmother Margaret Collins taught me that. Not through lectures, not through arguments, through a letter, a house, and a lawyer named Andrew Keller. I still go to church, by the way. Just not the same one. Different building. Same God. Smaller congregation. Better coffee. And I sit in the front row. Not because I need attention, because I'm done hiding in the back. For a long time I believed love meant endurance. I thought being a good daughter meant accepting whatever my family placed on my shoulders without questioning it. But what I learned through this experience is something much more honest. Love without respect slowly becomes a debt that never stops growing. Setting a boundary is not cruelty, and telling the truth is not betrayal. Sometimes it is the only way to protect the part of yourself that still believes life can be fair. I often wonder what you would do if you were standing where I once stood, hearing the truth about someone you trusted. Would you stay silent, or would you speak? Wherever you're listening from right now, I'm genuinely curious. Let me know in the comments. Stories like this travel farther than we think, and sometimes they reach someone who is quietly struggling with the same questions. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing the video. One simple click from you might help this story reach someone who needs the courage to draw their own boundary. And that small action could change more lives than either of us will ever know.